session number 4. Look, it's pretty exciting, but it's a ring-in with me. Professor Ramon Chabon just has a slight emergency problem with his new house. So I will announce it's great news for us because in Sydney, but Professor Ramon Chabon is actually moving to Sydney and he's just had to lease a property and there's something going on. So he just said, could I chair? So I won't be as good as him, but I'll give it a try. So the opening session today is really about science that changed my practice, and we're extremely lucky to have for this almost Q&A type session fantastic speakers. Professor Maaret Castren will start off. I'll just read the bios to let you know who's coming. The second member of our panel this afternoon is Dr. John Lambert, and we have our also delightful Professor Julie Considine. So what I've designed for the session is I'm going to read out their bios, and as I read out their bios, the light's going to come on. Well, actually it's already on, but it's going to look like it's come on, and they're going to sit at the Q&A chairs. What we'll do is we will ask the 3 questions of each of our speakers and give them that opportunity to speak, and then we'll have a discussion and a Q&A session around really how science has changed our practice, but in particular for these individuals. So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to introduce one of our keynote speakers of this conference. Maaret is a nurse and an anaesthesiologist and an emergency physician. She's working at the head of the emergency medicine services in Helsinki in Finland. She's making her way to the stage in case you thought it was something random. And she is leading the pre-hospital and emergency care for the 3 biggest cities in Finland, which is amazing. She became the first emergency professor in Sweden and at the Karolinska Institute in 2007, and is the first professor of emergency medicine in Finland, which is an amazing and speaks to the esteem that she's held in her country at the Turku University in 2012 and at Helsinki University in 2016. She is an international research she leads an international research group validated by external experts and is excellent to near outstanding. She is the chair of the European Resuscitation Council and a member of ELCOR. So thank you for joining us today. Closer to home, but no less prestigious, and in fact it's critically important, the work he's doing, because it will transform how we work. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Lambert as a practicing clinician with broad experience in information, communication, technology and development. John was the standout choice when the New South Wales Ministry of Health needed to appoint an eHealth New South Wales Chief Clinical Information Officer, for which he took up the appointment in 2014. Prior to his appointment to this inaugural position, he was working as a medical director of intensive care at Orange Health Services, so has a great understanding not just of metropolitan but rural and regional issues. With a passion for designing technology and related systems to help clinicians deliver better patient care, John has a long history contributing to major health projects, including hospital redevelopment, clinical information technologies, which is his passion, technology and communication systems, including the Critical Advisory Service in Western New South Wales Local Health District. At eHealth, John is focused on ensuring clinical programs are aligned and integrated while also enabling future innovation across New South Wales Health. If we could welcome Dr. John Lambert. Thank you. Fortunately, Julie thought I shouldn't read out too much of her bio, but I will read just a little bit because people do come and go to these different sessions. Our next speaker for the Q&A session is Professor Julie Considine, and she is an outstanding clinical researcher, one of our emergency clinical leaders in Australia. She's had 2 decades of being recognised in this role with many accolades, a huge number of publications, and with $5 million in grants, and is deeply committed, particularly in the areas of ARC, and that's why we were just at the previous meeting where she represents Australia on behalf of CENA. So thank you very much, Julie. So these are our panel members. Now, what I'd like to do is the questions that we've been posed is, and really looking at how science has changed my practice, what is it? Why is it important? And how did I translate it? So if we could start, we will start with the order as you entered the Q&A platform. So Maaret, you're welcome to use the roving mic. So if I can leave it with you just to talk about why is it important, what it is, why it is important, how did it translate? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to talk about one of my own studies, not because it's a great study, but it's because it actually changed two major things in my life. You can see it's done on actually on emergency calls, and I was out to look at the cardiac arrest calls. And when I listened to 776 calls, I realized that there is not a good end if there's a professional calling and a dispatcher answering. And as you can see in group 1, the survival is less if one of the professionals call. This made me realize that what we call professionals are actually two groups. There's professionals that are emergency professionals. They know cardiac arrest, they can act in critical situations. And then we have a huge bunch of other professionals. And until this study, we've actually treated them as one. After this study, I went back to my hospitals. I took all the very fancy gears and drugs and stuff away from the emergency charts. And it was basically hands-on CPR with adrenaline, no intubations, nothing. So I kind of said to them, you don't have to know something that you never actually experience. That you can be as a lay person in those critical things. You just need to know quickly what to do. This study also should have shown that when a dispatcher takes a call from a professional, you should act as that person would be a lay person. Of those 52 calls, 3 had actually secondary signs of death, and the professional in the other end asked for transport to University Hospital because they could not treat that patient anymore. That's why it was important. And then we've talked about how some things doesn't happen, and I was waiting for 15 years for somebody to actually say the same thing as I did, that professionals are not very good in making emergency calls. We're not trained to do that, actually. We're trained to do other things. Yeah, stuff. So the Danish now have said the same thing. So now let's see what happens with all of those things. Then another thing why I took up this study is the fact that when I did this, nobody talked about dispatching. And Julie can actually say that that's true. Nobody was interested in dispatching. How many of you have ever been to a dispatching center? Listened to some calls and realized how tough that is. And if they don't do a good job, we don't have anything to work on. As if we don't do a good job, ICUs has no work. So it was really important for me to realize that this was something that nobody was interested in. And then I started to nag about it. I nagged for years and years and years until 2005 they actually took it into the guidelines. That was the years when we had the first PICO questions. And the guidelines work started 1992, so it took a while. Then I nagged again and got it into the conference of the European Resuscitation Council. There's never been a session before that meeting. And now we can see that it's all over the world. There's dispatch research done, and that's actually one of the focus areas of resuscitation today. Still the same goddamn questions, PICOs. I have to start nagging again because we need different questions, not the same ones all the time. Yeah, and we have actually first PhDs in Finland now, dispatchers. So that's why it was important, and it changed a lot of things. And we had also a Utstein, as everybody else. We defined what is going on. 1996, when I did my study, I actually gave Finnish Dispatch Center compression-only guidelines. And I didn't know then that I should have written about it, because it seems that our dispatch center was the first in the world. But then I went to Sweden and we made a study showing that compression only is quite okay. And now there's all kinds of things, even looking at how fast you pick up the phone and answer. So there's really a huge area of dispatching research and practice. And I'm happy to say that I was one of the ones that had all of us pay attention to one of the very difficult areas, but one of the most important areas in the chain of survival.
Thank you, Maaret, for those enlightening words. We'll continue with the panel. So if I could ask Dr. John Lambert to talk about his sort of how science has changed your practice, or changed anything really, in terms of what is it, why is it important, and how did you translate it?
Sure, thanks. Firstly, I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me here. I feel a bit out of place because, unlike my introduction, I don't actually practice as a clinician anymore, sadly, due to the demands of the current role. But I still think and feel like a clinician. I have to say, when I turned up, I was really disconcerted because everybody kept looking at me strangely, and I thought, is it the lipoma on my head? Is it the fact that I'm 6'1"? I think it's because I got a tie on. And there's only one other person with a tie on, and he's wearing a uniform. And I don't know if that's good or bad from that perspective, but I think it correlates with having been inside a dispatch centre, because we both put our hands up for that question. So I think wearing a tie has something to do with being in ambulance dispatch centres. I'd also like to briefly acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past and present and future leaders in the audience. I often have to choose the slightly different tangent on these talks, and as an intensivist, you're probably aware of a lot of the intensive care research, and most of it tells you that all these wild and wonderful and exciting new things we're doing are a complete waste of time, whether it's colloids or blood or high pressure ventilation or all the other latest widgetry. So fortunately, most of the science that has influenced my practice has not come from the medical field at all. And I guess that's the point I want to make, that there's an awful lot of science and an awful lot of research that's occurring in fields unrelated to direct healthcare that is amazingly relevant to us. This is the College of Emergency Nursing, as far as I'm aware, and emergency nursing is a lot about queue management, a waiting list, people in waiting rooms, getting through certain tasks within very tight time constraints where there's a lot of tasks. And engineers have been dealing with queuing forever. They have, engineering 101, first year engineering, there's a subject called queuing theory. How many people have heard of queuing theory? Good. It's great to see so many hands, all 5 of you. But I'd encourage you to have a look at it. My dad was an engineer, so I got a cheats exposure to this. But when we were planning new hospital developments, and my father was involved in Nepean Hospital a long time ago, he's 91 today, and with the hospital redevelopments I've been involved with at Royal Prince Alfred and Orange, I tried very hard to help people understand how queuing theory, which is not the same as statistical mean arrival times and service times, there's a very different theory behind it, can actually do a much better job of describing how many beds we should have, how many waiting bays, how many bays for ambulance. You can actually model this stuff with incredible accuracy and predict how many times a year you're going to exceed your capacity. And yet I see very few organisations actually doing that systematically. So that was one example. Another example of research that's affected me is finite element analysis. This is probably a little bit more obscure. I don't know how many of you wonder how engineers come up with the shapes and designs of bridges, tall buildings, etc. But nowadays they do modelling of the stress and strain of the actual materials of the building when it's subjected to wind forces, earthquakes, gravitational forces, the weight loading of 1,000 people sitting on a floor like we are on today. And interestingly, that has a lot of application to physiology and parts of the body that we don't understand well, like the wall of the myocardium or the internal fibroelastic skeleton of the lung. And finite element analysis and the principles behind that have guided my ventilation practice more than any other science. And it is interesting, it's a bit of a dark hole in the physiology textbooks. We've all read West, pulmonary physiology and pathophysiology. There's a total hole in the bit between the pleural cavity and the space inside the alveoli. And that hole is filled with an awful lot of really interesting stuff. A whole lot of collagen and elastin and a beautiful three-dimensional network architecture, which is just not mentioned. And it's actually the most important factor in ventilation management. And the sooner we realise that, I think we'll make a very large leap in ventilation practice. So that was another non-medical research which influenced my practice as a practising respiratory intensivist. And then the final one, which I still work with today, interestingly, in the new role as the CCIO, is about human factors and user-centred design, human-centred design. Now, I think increasingly clinical practice is aware of this now and aware of the interaction between humans and their environment, humans and their equipment. You know, designing even down to the simple level of making sure that chairs are adjustable, because we have clinicians that range from 4 foot in height to 6'4" in height, and that 2.4 foot difference needs to be catered for in everything, whether it's adjustable beds and all the ergonomic tools that nursing staff are much more aware of than doctors in general, to, in my new environment, understanding how a user interface is interpreted by humans in their active working practice, and how we can do a better job of aligning the digital tools we create with the way clinicians and patients actually interact with our world. And believe it or not, the takeaway message I've learned from that is that work as imagined is nothing like work as done. So if you sit in a room and think about what you do, or explain, if I tried to explain to you what I did as a CCIO, and then you came and walked around with me for a week, you would say, John, you're an idiot. What you told me you did is nothing like what you actually do. And that's the truth of just about every person in their work practice. And human-centred design is all about understanding what people actually do, as opposed to what they think they do. And it's a really powerful lesson. It's a science that isn't particularly health-related, and it still serves me today as it did back when I was an intensivist, trying to design a workspace in the new hospitals we were building that would optimally make the clinicians working in it, myself and my team included, better clinicians, simply through the design of the walls and the layout of the floor and the sink and the height of the taps and where all the equipment stood, so that we didn't constantly trip over ourselves or some equipment while we were trying to resuscitate a patient. So those are the three sort of non-health related sciences that have really influenced my practice throughout my life, and including in my current role, which is less clinical. So I hope that is answering the questions.
Fantastic. And our final speaker for the Q&A session, Professor Julie Considine. Have you got your...
Yeah, I've got the clicker.
And you've got the remote?
Yeah, hang on, I've just got my hands right. So I guess the evidence that changed my practice was really largely around recognising and responding to deteriorating patients. So I'd done a lot of work, as some of you will know, in the area of triage. I'd spent about 10 years researching triage and triage decision making, and how do triage nurses work out who's sick and who's not. And what became apparent to me, and at the time I was working as a clinical nurse educator in some EDs in Melbourne, was there were no real efforts around recognising and responding to deteriorating patients after the triage process. So, and at that time I was doing my PhD, so I was really aware of all this evidence, and this was back in sort of 1999, 2000, where we were just starting to understand that, you know, the majority of adverse events were preceded by clearly abnormal vital signs. And, you know, historically on the wards, if someone got sick, they called the MET team, and you had the, you know, ICU team come and sort your patient out. It was all great. In the ED, we wore this badge of honour, like, oh, we'll sort it out. We've got this. It's cool. We're ED nurses. And so I kind of thought, well, that's all fine and well. And then when I looked at the evidence, you know, there were clear predictors of hospital admission that were evident in the ED, and if you look at the OBS up there, you know, clearly they're going nowhere, maybe to John's ICU, but nowhere else. There were clear predictors in the ED of who was going to die in hospital. And then I did some work in the late 2000s looking at predictors of ICU admission that were evident at triage, and it was, again, the same stuff, you know, abnormal vital signs, chief complaints. Can I just tell you that abdominal complaints in anyone over 45, perilous, no good at all. And so then I kept thinking, well, if the ED's got this, why was I as a nurse educator involved in so many root cause analyses of stuff going so wrong? And at the time, there were 2 incidents in the ED that I was working in that both resulted in coroner's cases, so you know how that kind of ended. And they were both patients who had had prolonged, sustained hypotension. The nurses had beautifully documented these patients' demise. They'd beautifully documented that they'd reported to a medical officer. But in both cases, it was a junior nurse that reported to a junior doctor who didn't know what to do, and so said to the nurse, just do more OBS, and so they did. And these patients died, and they probably didn't need to. And so then I got to thinking, well, if that was my whoever, mum, dad, husband, on a ward with a blood pressure of 80, they would get a MET call, they would get reviewed by a consultant intensivist, and they would have senior decision makers involved in their care. So why on earth does that not happen in the emergency department? In the emergency department, you're at the mercy of the clinician on the day that takes your blood pressure. And if it's a good ED nurse with lots of experience who knows that that's a bad thing, then hopefully stuff will happen for you. But there was no guarantee. And so this bothered me greatly. And so at the time, I was working with a bunch of great colleagues. So I know that Bart Wunderlich and Danielle Waddell are up in the audience, and emergency physicians like Helen Sturgio. And so we decided that this actually wasn't right. It wasn't right that our patients in the ED had a lower level of response to a patient on a ward. And so we kind of embarked on this journey where we thought, right, we need to have some system, some safety net for these patients. And there was no, the question was, how did I translate it? But there was no I, it was a we. It took a village. It took half an ED and a bit of evidence. But we came up with some quite defined criteria about, because what was apparent to us is we had no definition of what a deteriorating patient was in the ED. The wards had a definition with their MET criteria, or between the flags or whichever system you're using, but we had no clear definition of deteriorating patient in ED. And so we adapted the ward MET criteria with some tweaks using the evidence that was available at the time. And we came up with a clear escalation of care protocol and a response. And the response was that if a patient fulfilled these criteria, the nurse was to report to the emergency physician who was in charge of the shift and the nurse in charge of the shift, and that emergency physician would review the patient within 5 minutes. And so there was a core group of us in the ED at the time that thought this was a fabulous idea. And then we presented it to the emergency physician group, who said, you want to do what? We're not doing that. I was like, well, why not? It's your job. Like, well, we're too busy. But it's your job. You're an emergency physician. Your job is to find sick people and do stuff to them. And I'm like, well, we don't want to do that. Really? So it took a lot of public relations, and it took a lot of persuasion. The nurses were not so much polarised, so there were a lot of nurses that thought it was a good idea. But there were certainly experienced emergency nurses who were highly offended. They're like, no, we've got this. I can sort this. I don't need to be doing this. And then we kind of brought it back to, and I think when you're trying to implement behaviour change in any clinical practice setting, if you bring it back to the patient, it's pretty hard to argue with that. So that's exactly what we did. But we also talked about the benefits to the team. And I'd say to the physicians, but surely you would want to just go and spend 5 or 10 minutes reviewing a patient, writing up some fluid, giving some antibiotics now, than in 5 hours, putting in a central line, ringing ICU, starting the NORA. Like, isn't that better? Maybe not as much fun, but isn't that better? They're like, maybe. So it took a lot of work. We did a lot of work out on the floor. And one of the things that we did after we kind of persuaded our physician colleagues, because nurses are very persuasive when we want to be, that it was a good idea. Then we had to work on the public relations stuff. And so we said to them, you will get the graduate nurse that will come to you and say, my patient's heart rate is 121, because 120 was our threshold. And I said, you have to smile and be nice and get up and go and see their patient, no matter how pissed off you are about the whole process. And they're like, all right then. So anyway, it worked actually really well. And so we did some research and published the results. We found that there was pretty good uptake. And this was really before any emergency departments that I knew of in Melbourne had implemented these systems. It's interesting, those of you that were in the publication workshop yesterday, we were talking about peer review, and I just submitted a paper to a journal that I won't name, but it's a really prominent emergency medicine journal, about this stuff. And I got a scathing review about why are you even doing this, there is no problem. I'm like, really? Have you looked at your coroner's court transcripts lately in whichever state you're in? So there is still, and I present this stuff in different forums, it's still very polarising amongst the emergency medicine community. The emergency nursing community seem to think that this is actually a good idea and in the best interests of patient care. But I think, when you translate stuff, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I think you do have a professional responsibility to put the results of those efforts out there, whether it's in a journal publication or a conference presentation. But we've done a lot of work in this space, and now what we're starting to understand, and the study that we've just published, this one on this side, shows that there's a clear relationship between people's physiology in the emergency department and the risk of a MET call in the first 3 days of hospital admission. And so, it's about the whole patient journey. It's about keeping patients safe, but it's also about understanding risk. And I think as emergency nurses, risk management is front and centre of what we do. It's our job. So I think now most EDs have some kind of system in place that certainly define clinical deterioration and trigger an escalation of care. I'm not convinced nationally that we've got the response stuff quite worked out, and I do acknowledge it will depend on the context and the resources available. Some EDs have a very structured, consistent response, some it's a little bit more ad hoc. But I think, when you feel really strongly about a patient care issue and a patient safety issue, no matter how much you get poo-hooed and you're tutted and your eyes rolling, and you've just got to keep grinding away, chipping away. And like I said, I think if you make it about the patient, it's pretty hard for people to argue against that. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to, before opening it to the floor, is just to maybe capture some of the sentiments of, really the importance while changing practice, which is what all of you have been doing within your roles. Substantially across countries or across continents or across local hospitals. It's extraordinary, but it's certainly the passion with which to deliver best practice is, we couldn't have 3 better exemplars from the works that you're doing. And some of the backgrounds that we need to obviously go and look at more broader literature outside. Sometimes we can get very precious, and I just look at the nursing literature or the emergency nursing literature. And so we've got to remember that often when we're looking for solutions, the broader you go, the more creative and innovative you can become in the service that you're leading and the team that you're working with. So before we go to the session, I'd just like to thank our speakers again. And I'd like to open the floor for any questions. We've got speakers either side, so is there any questions for any of the speakers? And I'll just look upstairs as well. Oh, good on you. I've got a few, but I thought I should wait.
Thank you. So this is thanks for your presentation. This is a question primarily for John, but it's based on what Maaret and Julie have both talked about. So
Sounds tricky.
As an e-health guru, and what you do is going to impact us, how can you be implementing things within the electronic systems that we are using that help us with picking up deterioration and that help consider human factors but aren't really a pain in the arse to use?
There's a few different ways I could answer this. How many of you are from New South Wales, by the way? Oh yeah, that's about right. About a third, like the population. So bearing in mind that I'm only responsible for New South Wales Health and for what eHealth New South Wales produces within New South Wales Health, and that's pretty clear. I wouldn't call myself a guru, and Julie's teasing me already. By the way, as somebody who grew up on Dr. Seuss, I had no idea it was so relevant to clinical practice. They were some great Dr. Seuss quotes. I'm going to have to use them myself. The current state of New South Wales is very complex. We've got 30 different entities that make up New South Wales Health. 18 of those provide direct patient care, and that's 15 local health districts and 3 specialty networks, which are to a degree autonomous. They're in a loose federation. We, in those LHDs, run 10 completely different EMRs. 7 of them happen to be produced by one company, Cerner, and the other 3 are produced by 2 other different companies. And they are like chalk and cheese. They have very little similarities with each other, the different company solutions. Cerner, admittedly, is a little bit more consistent, but the implementation of Cerner in every district and even every hospital is different. So when I'm speaking to a clinician from New South Wales, I usually have to ask them, which hospital do you work in? And then I can understand what their problems are, because they'll be different in each different area. So keeping that all in mind, we're talking about the emergency department system. Now, I'm not saying this is a good idea or not, but I will say I wasn't there when the decision was made. But the systems we're using in emergency in New South Wales were first chosen and implemented sometime before 2007. Okay, so just bear in mind that in 2007 we only just started having the first iPhone. 2010, I think, was the first iPad. And these systems were designed before that, and yet everybody expects the EMR systems in ED to work like current generation touch interface technology, and why can't you deliver it faster? What I'm doing at the moment is actually trying to get an interest level at executive level and the people who push the big dollars that it takes to implement these systems in 200 plus hospitals with 100,000 clinicians impacted to say, actually, that stuff we did in 2007 probably needs another look at it and probably needs a refresh. So once that agreement is made that it is worth reinvesting in the area we first started with, I think you'll see a lot more change. So the first thing is we've got to get a priority agreement that, the ED system definitely needs a refresh. Now, I might think that. I know there's a few executives with me, but I haven't convinced the whole system to actually invest in it. Once that is done, what I have been able to achieve in the 3 years, and we're about to get approval from the highest governance body of eHealth in New South Wales for this, is to actually design solutions using human-centred design. I mentioned it in my research influence. And I know that if we use human-centred design, and there's evidence to support this statement, we will produce tools that are more usable by clinicians. So they won't be such a pain in the ass. Because I agree, so many of our systems are absolutely ludicrous. We did a customer survey of all New South Wales people. Some of you may have contributed. Thank you if you did. But 70% of the respondents said the most important thing for them that they want from eHealth New South Wales is systems that are fit for purpose. In the same response, they said 70% of the systems we're producing are not fit for purpose. So that's a really strong message to do something. And I have managed to get the support of a lot of different people to change the way we design our solutions, to design them through human-centred design. Now, in the same time frame, a lot of our vendors have caught on to this as well, and there are much better solutions. Now, in New South Wales, we have a thing called Between the Flags, which has been replicated in an electronic or digital environment. I believe it's in use in most EDs. All the EDs I've walked into are using the BTF, so we're using BTF and an electronic format of that. It's been recently revised. I hope all of you have the newer version operating in your EDs. I hope you would agree the new version is better than the old one. I still wouldn't be proudly saying it's the best UI I've ever seen. We are actually in the process of redesigning it again, and we'll be seeking expressions of interest from all of you to be involved in that design process. And so we're trying to use some social media and crowdsourcing tools, the internet basically, to allow technically an unlimited number of people to contribute to the design process. I know that might sound a bit, how the hell do you do that? Don't worry, we're wondering too. But we've got, we will allow you to see the design process as it goes on. You'll be able to contribute. You'll be able to sort of put comments in that saying, look, this is a lovely design, but it's not going to work in this circumstance, and then that will influence the core decision makers. So we really are trying to change the way we design the tools to be human-centred and actually useful. We're bringing the vendors along with us, but to answer your problem of solving the problem in front of every clinician in all of the, 25,000 ED beds in New South Wales, that requires a fair investment and prioritisation, and that has to happen as well, and that's sometimes the hardest challenge.
Well, it's good to have you leading the way. You're such a pragmatic, sensible person.
Yeah, thank
I'm
you.
getting all the compliments
And-
today. Thank you.
And John,
I was feeling low today too. I needed the boost.
There you go. We're always here. And just to
walk
add
up
that,
to any ED.
that in terms of if you're looking to use social media and the internet to get some of that feedback, maybe you would consider CINA, contacting CINA, that it could be distributed out through memberships so people can have a say around and feedback around some of the comments that you might like to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My office holds clinical engagement forums, which I would hope some of the people here have seen an invitation for a thing called a clinical engagement forum. You can recognise them because they've got a photo of my silly face on the invite usually. And they're held using online techniques. So we've got web streaming, online collaboration, question answering tools, etc. So they're designed for busy clinicians who can't always get off shift. The events of the evening are recorded, and we have them on specific topics, so it won't be too long before we have one specifically on emergency medicine. I'd be delighted to take your offer up on CINA. In fact, we're going one step further. We've been holding 5 to 7 clinical engagement forums a year since I started in this role, since a year after I started. And they've been aimed at clinicians of New South Wales Health, but we're actually planning to hold a citizen engagement forum next year. So we're going to allow patients and carers and all the other people that matter so much to our patients to give us some pretty cold and direct input as to what they think are the important things we need to do. Because we really should be designing systems for patients, not really for clinicians first up. Clinicians are important, don't worry, I'm one of you, but patients are probably more important than us.
Thank you very much, John. Anyone else, any questions? Yep, would you just come out?
So, John, when you open up that forum, it'll obviously be more for the New South Wales people because that's who you're responsible to. But Queensland's not gone very far in our EMR journey. And obviously there's a lot of learnings that we can glean from that. So is there a way that you could make those findings transparent to us?
Absolutely. Sorry, like everybody wants to talk about digital nowadays. I don't know why. It's really boring, really. You guys stole my boss, I just want to have you know. Your Director General used to be my boss. He was a great boss. I hope he's a great Director General for you. But through him and through other connections I've got, we're certainly exchanging ideas with Queensland. I personally have no issue with Queensland practitioners joining our forums. And in fact, New South Wales is actually unique. We border the most number of jurisdictions of any state in Australia. We have 4 different jurisdictions we've got to deal with: Queensland, South Australia, Victoria and ACT. I keep thinking Northern Territory borders us, but it doesn't quite. So that means we've got to do this. We've got to solve many of our problems across the boundaries. I'm sure Albury, Tweed, Broken Hill, Griffith, all these sites that are near the borders, even Wagga and Canberra, Queanbeyan, you're all exchanging patients with each other across these boundaries. So if we don't solve the problems of that, we're not really solving anybody's problems. So we've got a lot of connections. I'm connected with, there's a new equivalent to me in Queensland, Keith McNeil, I hope I've got his name right, who's come from the UK to be the CCIO of Queensland. We've already had discussions about sharing ideas. We're happy to give all of our ideas and technology to Queensland and vice versa. So if you'd like to directly approach my office and see what we can do more than that, please
Definitely,
do.
I will do. Yep.
It's senseless to repeat effort. You know, it's hard enough getting things done once, let alone getting them done 4 times. So
Yeah.
I'm as open as I can be, time limiting, but I know you've got some good people in Queensland who are keen to do this sort of work, so I'm sure we can get there.
Yeah, but if we don't capture those learnings before we start on the journey, then particularly for some of the regional centres, and as you were saying before, everyone implements in a different way. So some want to implement HHS wide, some want to implement just with their main hospital first, and some go big bang, and some do it in stages.
I'll be speaking of this a little bit in my talk later, but a lot of that's about us, clinicians, not about the organisation. I mean, I know Queensland and Victoria wanted to roll out consistent foundational systems that were the same in all locations for the really important stuff. They didn't necessarily mean that everybody had to use exactly the same, configuration.
No.
But most of those plans came asunder because of activities of clinicians, not because the administration wanted it. In New South Wales, we've got this very interesting situation. before we became LHDs, we were 8 area health services, and they were legally very separated boundaries. We couldn't even share information across the boundaries. We then became 18 LHDs and specialty networks, but the law around information flow was changed so that we can now share information statewide. I don't know if that happened in Victoria or Queensland or not, but with that change was a big devolution and decision-making powers going to the LHDs. The latest minister and the secretary is much more, look, it's all very well to have things that are customised to unique needs, but there also needs to be some stuff that we need to be a little bit more tight on. Maybe BTF is a good example, the way we manage with deteriorating patients. That really should be the same in all locations. We've got so many doctors and nurses and allied health professionals who move around to have to deal with a different way of managing this basic treatment process seems insane. So I think there's an increasing chorus from the central government agencies trying to get that consistency, and I don't know if that's happening in Queensland and Victoria. It's all a bit different in the different states. I don't know if everybody can hear, but we're just the comments made. The HHSs in Queensland, which is like the local health districts in New South Wales, there's an expectation eHealth is going to solve these problems, but there isn't a lot of collaboration with the HHSs. Is that the point you're making? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I've got a question for Julie. I'm embarrassed to say that my department doesn't have a functioning SIRS response in our ED. We are exploring it and we're having a look at things, and we're trying to use the electronic options we have to identify how many times we respond with a clinical review or rapid response. So I'm interested in your views about who should manage the admitted patients in an emergency department if they clinically deteriorate.
Hang on, I'll just get a steak and make a fire, and then I'll... All right, so my personal view is that if you've got an admitted patient in the emergency department and they have a critical and sudden deterioration, I think ethically and morally as ED staff, you have to respond. You have to intervene, you have to do something. And you can bleat all you want that that's not my patient, but if that's my mum or dad, I don't actually care. So, but I think the challenge is, as we implement these local ED, rapid response teams or MET teams or whatever you want to call them, and we do activate those systems on patients who are boarding in the ED waiting for a bed, how do we engage the parent unit and how do we make sure that they know that their patient has deteriorated? And I don't think we've got that sorted just yet. You have? You do? Yeah, good. So ask Kate, she knows all the answers. But I think the one thing that I really hate is that the patient gets used as a ping pong ball and a political football between the ED and the inpatient teams. And for me, that's not okay, and it puts people at risk.
Kate, did you want to just say how you solve the problem?
I mean, I've heard emergency physicians talk about if there's a border patient in the ED that deteriorates, the nurses should call the hospital MET team down to the ED because they're too busy. Now, is this being recorded? I think that's bullshit. I'm sorry, but I do. It doesn't matter. It's just ethically wrong. But I do think we need to engage the parent unit, and they do need to take some responsibility for the plan of care for that patient moving forward, whether that's to refer to ICU, HDU, or whether that's to look at end-of-life treatment options or whatever the case may be. But I think you just got to do what's right for the patient.
Thanks. Matt?
Thank you, guys. I had a question just around how do we manage the deteriorating patient and the alerts that go with that, and the decision fatigue or the alert fatigue that goes with EMR building, and how do we manage that, that interface where you're constantly getting alerts and actually that time at the computer is dragging you away from actually managing the deteriorating patient. Have you any thoughts on how we should approach that?
I'll answer and I'll hand over to John. But I think one of the unintended consequences, and I understand why MET and Between the Flags and those systems were put in place, and we had a very mandated approach. If your patient meets criteria X, then you call a MET team and there's no ifs, buts or maybes. And I get why we went down that approach. I worry that we've swung too far that way, and what I'm hearing now, which is quite disturbing from not only student nurses but nurses on the wards, is that they will do a set of vital signs, and the patient might have walked to the toilet, they've come back, their respiratory rate's 32. They don't write that down because they know that if they put that on a chart and they don't call the Met team, they're going to get pinged when they get audited. And so they just keep that to themselves, and they do all the right nursing things. They sit the patient down, they might put some oxygen on, and then they'll reassess the patient in 5 minutes and their respiratory rate's 22, and that's the number that goes on the chart. Now, for me, that's just a bit disturbing because, one, you've got this clinical information that is goodness knows where, but number two, I think a lot of these systems don't acknowledge the scope of practice interventions that registered nurses can put in place. And I'm not sure that for every patient that... And I'm also convinced that patients... I know this is a bit politically incorrect, but I think nurses know what is a true deterioration Met call really sick patient versus what's a temporary blip in someone's physiology because of exertion or something else. And I know not all nurses know that, and I know that Met's designed for the lowest common denominator, but I think there's got to be systems in place that enable nurses to alter alarms. I mean, the fact that a nurse can't alter... you've got a patient in AF. As a registered nurse with a million qualifications, I can't say, look, a heart rate of 140 is okay for that patient for the next 2 hours. I've loaded them with whatever. The fact I can't do that as a nurse does my head in. But I think the alarms need to allow for scope of practice. They need to be tailored to individual patient physiology, but also make sure patients are safe by the same token. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But can I just interrupt for... The solution is integration, and I've been trying for 6 months to try and, with a new physiological monitoring system, and whatever's in the middle, which I still don't really understand, and the clinicians, so being able to pull data into your electronic medical record that's validated and checked and not just pulled in without any validation at all. And also being able to use the monitor as a direct data entry point. So you're at the bedside typing, talking to your patient, writing your orders, looking at x-rays, giving electronic medications. That's the solution, and we're sitting on the verge of that, I think, with lots of things, and that will be a game changer because it will mean nurses won't walk around with observations written on alcohol swabs and on hand towels and have to leave the patient to go and find an electronic device and then log on and find a way to put that in while their patient continues to deteriorate.
As somebody who's inherently built to find solutions to problems, it's been very hard for me to learn that the best thing you can do when you're trying to solve problems is not jump to solution mode too early. What has just been mentioned is part of a possible solution, but isn't the whole solution. And the reason it's not the whole solution is you need to investigate who are all the people affected. There's a nurse, sure, there's a patient obviously, but there's also other clinicians who have to respond and the complexities of who they are. And yes, it's all very well to say the patient, the doctor responsible for the patient should be notified, but really, always, even when they're on the toilet? So when you start looking as what they actually do, you suddenly see that it's more complex than you thought originally. Alerts in particular, anybody who understands modern user interface design would say to you, an alert is your method of last resort. And yet in the 80s, it was the method of first choice. The other problem is the word. To us, well, to me, an alert is a methodology for raising awareness in a clinician that something important is happening. That's all it means. To a software developer, an alert is a very specific user interface concept, which is a rectangular, usually, object that appears on screen that is modal and won't go away until the user does something, like pressing an OK box. That's an alert to a programmer, which is very different. So when you're in a room with a programmer and you say, I need an alert, you don't mean I want a bloody box that gets in my way and stops me doing anything until I've hit OK. You're actually saying, I just want to know. And who's I? Not necessarily me. I want the right person to know. Who's the right person? Well, that's a story. And so this is where user journeys and stories and human-centered design comes into it. So I would say to you that alerts are almost never a good user interface device. We have far too many of them, and they've got to be gotten rid of and replaced with something better. You'll notice if you've had a smartphone for any length of time that the process of notification has changed over the last 10 years. And those of you who, I don't know what Android does, but the iOS has about sort of 6 different ways of notifying you things. There's vibration-only alerts, there's audio, there's these alerts that sort of waft up and then waft away without you doing anything, there's sidebars, there's all sorts of interesting possibilities now in modern user interface design. And we, as e-health digital people, need to help inform clinicians of the options available. Clinicians need to use their normal language to describe what they need, and IT people need to stop thinking that they're speaking IT. But as I'll say again this afternoon, it's also about us as clinicians starting to learn a little bit more about health informatics, about how software works and is designed, because then we can more effectively contribute to the discussion about what the solution might look like. And you know, you might think it's simple, you know, BTF, deterioration, notification of somebody out of alert, but your study of listening to conversations, you listen to 700 and something recordings, right? That's how you learn work as done. That's how you understand what these people are thinking about, what inputs they're using, how they're making decisions. And when you truly understand that, the context of operation, then you can start saying, well, these are the problems. And just getting the problem statements right is really hard. People love jumping to solutions, but we don't spend enough time defining what the problems are. Once you've got them, then there's a whole new science about how you then get to a possible technical digital solution, assuming a digital solution is the right answer. Like, I've seen situations where people have tried to build something in an EMR. It shouldn't be there. We're not using the EMR when we're actually intubating somebody. So why would you write something in an EMR to support intubation? Sorry, I'm busy looking for the vocal cords. Get out of my way, you know?
Exactly.
Why would you put something like that in the EMR? It's insane. So they're not thinking about the work as done. I don't know if you want to comment about what you learned.
No, I just want to say something funny. You know, because it's so depressing to talk about these IT things. We're just in the process of getting Epic. Oh, okay. And in this process, people are telling us their wishes and stuff like that, and it's very hard for you as people to understand what Finland needs. And we're kind of, in my way, going backwards instead of frontwards. But the funny thing was that the surgeons told us that they think that it's you don't have to put in the medical list at all in the medical records because you don't need that. Oh. Okay, just because you guys never look at them doesn't mean that we don't need them.
That's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about EMR, my health service is about to roll out Cerner in October. And I think one of the tensions that I see constantly is that many health services or LHDs, whatever you want to call them, they implement their EMR with their mind firmly set in a compliance framework. And then we operate in a quality and safety framework, and there's this clash in the middle, and I'm not sure how we're going to resolve that. But, you know, they see the EMR as being able to track every time a clinician farts and blows their nose, you know, and that's not what... It's not what healthcare's about. And so I think there is this tension, and I think it's going to take probably a decade to resolve that.
Look, we'll just have time for one last question, please.
Hi, I'm Liz Walter. I'm an ED CNC, but previously having worked in a dispatch centre, my question is for... so my question was more around, do you think that more education needs to occur in dispatch centres around the different scopes of practice of different nurses, and perhaps how would that look like? Because it would be quite hard for a dispatch caller to say, are you an emergency nurse, or are you critical care, or are you... How would it look so that they get a gauge of the situation to create better outcomes?
Yeah, I wish I would have the answer, because there's no studies actually looking at who should be sitting in the dispatch center. And in Finland, we don't have nurses. We have dispatchers that are trained for 1.5 years. They detect over 80% of all the cardiac arrests. At the same time, when systems where there are nurses detect 52%. And it depends on what you're looking at, because a nurse is not a good one if there's a critical illness and you need to be fast. A dispatcher without medical profession is not good at the elderly people with a little bit non-specific symptoms calling in and you know, arguing about if they need an ambulance or not. So it's a very complex world, and it's like 8 to 10% of this critically ill, and the rest is not. So who do we actually put in the dispatch center? We've been thinking of a study, because some systems have physicians. I think that's the worst scenario. Yeah, I mean, we tried that, and they didn't ask for the address, so that was like, oh, okay, fantastic. Yeah. Then we have nurses, and we have specially trained nurses, or just firemen. We have police, and we have dispatchers. I don't know the answer.
It's interesting. All right, thank you. I think we'll close the session because Professor Kate Curtis has informed me there's a few more prizes coming, so I've got to allocate a few minutes for that later on. But if we could thank our fantastic Q&A speakers. And we'll just allow you to safely come and...